All right, welcome to chapter 14, the home stretch. We've got power, influence, and leadership today. Let's go ahead and get right into it. This week, we've got our 7 learning objectives. From the top, we've got describe manager's appropriate use of power and influence, identify traits and characteristics of successful leaders, identify behaviors of successful leaders, describe situational leadership, describe transactional and transformational leadership. 14.6, we've got describe contemporary leadership perspectives and concepts, and 14.7, explain how to develop the career readiness competency of self-awareness. So 7 learning objectives this week. I think this is the last chapter with 7 learning objectives. I think from here on in it's only 6. So 7 learning objectives for your projects this week. All of this containing really good information in your textbook and hopefully through this video lecture. Career Corner, improving your leadership skills, discover your leadership style, adopt a proactive learning orientation, recognize that there is no single best way to lead, show your followers that you value them, and practice mindfulness. So discover your leadership style. So we all develop a style of leadership based on personal characteristics, traits, gender, interpersonal skills, utilization of power, and influence. Identifying your relationship style is thus an ongoing process that evolves as you acquire more experience and responsibility in the workplace. You can think of this process as simply discovering your strengths are over time and developing some flexible ways to use them in helping others achieve goals. So with that one, think about some of the teachers that you've come across in your travels over, your elementary, middle school, and high school years, and think about how some of those different teachers, either led or ran their classrooms. And this is what we're kind of talking about, where every single individual has a different style of leadership that they are most comfortable with, that they can run, and sometimes it's a little bit of a game where you kind of have to figure out what sort of leader you are, especially in the early going. That's for one of the reasons why I think, being a young teacher is really, really tough, where you got guys and gals that are still trying to figure it out. And it takes them, maybe a year or two before they kind of figure out, okay, this is my style. This is how I can run, my classroom, to the best of my ability to get the best results. And you see that a lot in management too. You see that a lot in business, where you have, young managers, young individuals who are, maybe fresh out of college, never really had the experience of working in an office before. And all of a sudden, they're kind of thrown into the fire a little bit, and they have to kind of figure out, okay, well, what's my style? How am I going to get people to, follow me, complete tasks, drive the company forward? So discovering your leadership style, there's some growing pains. You got to take the bad, leave the good. This leadership's a thing that you can read about in, it's one of those things where it may not perfectly fit for you every single time, but there is a lot of value in trying to discover your leadership style. Then we've got adopt a proactive learning orientation. So this suggestion flows naturally from the first. So it's all about, learning, becoming a leader. It doesn't actually end. So it's, learning about you, yourself, your skills, your industry, your strengths, your weaknesses throughout your career. Then we've got, the ability, you can take classes, courses, you can talk with peers, ask questions, stay open-minded, seek challenges, look outside your industry for ideas and practices. So always be proactive, with learning. Never stop learning, regardless of what career you end up in. Number 3, recognize that there is no single best way to lead. So when events arise, whether they're good or bad, these events can be seen as neutral, but if they see their response or these events as crucial, you will need to adapt your leadership style to each situation that calls for it. So sometimes, whether it's a good, bad situation, leaders, have to be able to sort of keep that level head, whether it's a good situation, you don't want to get too high, you don't want to get too low, depending on the situation. You really want to try and keep that level head and kind of be that voice of reason, whatever the situation calls for. So you have to recognize that, there's no single best way to lead, but oftentimes you do need to keep your cool. Show your followers that you value them. So delegate responsibility to those you lead and earn their respect by modeling ethical behavior. Always give credit where credit is due, praise in public, criticize in private, and ask for help when you need it. Don't be stingy with compliments and encouragement. Practice mindfulness. You can reduce stress and worry, sharpen your focus, and make more thoughtful decisions by adopting the habits of mindfulness, which means focusing, your awareness on present and accepting your feelings and thoughts. All right, as we get in now to 14.1, the overview. The nature of leadership. So the role of power influence. So what is the difference between leading and managing? Managerial leadership. Can you be both a manager and a leader? We'll talk about the 6 sources of power, common influence tactics, and then how to use those tactics to influence outcomes. So you can see this table here on page 599 in your book, and it just talks about some of the differences between being a manager and being a leader there. And I'm not going to insult your intelligence by reading off what it means to be a manager, what it means to be a leader, but do know that there are some distinct differences between being a manager and being a leader. While the two things can be synonymous, it doesn't necessarily, not all managers are necessarily the greatest leaders. Not all leaders are necessarily managers. I think you guys probably recognize this, in the classroom where, or on the sports field or wherever you're at. Sometimes you recognize that, the best player isn't necessarily always the best leader. They might be, the most important player, but they're not necessarily always the best leader. And the same goes for in the workplace, where you might have an individual who, is kind of seen as, just another employee, but they take leadership to heart, and they, really lead, lead their unit, lead their department, even though they're maybe not necessarily the person calling all of the shots, right? And you can see there in the table that there are a lot of different characteristics of being a leader. And, while not every single leader is going to maybe exhibit every single characteristic there that table 14.1 is going to show, leadership, a lot of times is going to be, exhibiting a lot of the qualities that you see there. It can be kind of tough sometimes, let's say, if you're, a secretary that, shows great leadership. Well, they may not necessarily be responsible for the visionary of the company, the long-term focus, but there can be so much more that they do in terms of setting the tone, being inspiring, managing people, acting decisively, where it's, you look at that individual and they're like, okay, well, they're not the CEO of the company, right? They're not the visionary for the next 5 to 7 years, but man, they're a leader. They really take a look and they really set the tone. They're the inspiration. They really keep, the trains on the track here, and they keep things moving. So, you have to kind of be aware that leadership has many different forms, and that this table really kind of takes a look at really all of those sort of different forms when it comes to leadership. So leaders inspire others, provide emotional support, and try to get employees to rally around a common goal. Leaders also play a key role in creating a vision and strategic plan for an organization. Managers typically perform functions associated with planning, investigating, organizing, and control, and leaders focus on influencing others. Managers, in turn, are charged with implementing the vision and plan. We can draw several conclusions from this division of labor. Like I said, good leaders are not necessarily good managers. Good managers are not necessarily good leaders. So managers, they conduct the planning, organizing, directing, and control. Leaders inspire, encourage, rally others to achieve great goals. Managers implement a company's vision and plan. Leaders create and articulate that vision and plan. So again, a lot of key differences there between managers and leaders. Managing leadership. So can you be both a manager and a leader? So managerial leadership includes influencing others to internalize, so committing to a set of shared goals and facilitating the group and individual work that is needed to accomplish those goals. Manager leadership may be demonstrated by managers and also by those who exercise leadership on a daily basis. So in short, yeah, it's possible for managers to be both a manager and a leader. You just have to, recognize that they're not necessarily the same, right? They're not necessarily, synonymous with one another, but it is one of those things where you can see it from, managers being great leaders. And, I think, if you've ever held a part-time job, you've probably seen this, where you've probably had good managers who, take an interest in the person, in you as a person, inspire you, but while still rallying you around, a common goal. And you've probably had bad managers where, you come in and they're like, here, this is what's got to get done, do it, basically. They're the ones sort of carrying out the plan. So you've probably seen this at some point in your life in terms of, whether it's been a part-time job you've worked, maybe it's a coach you've had, um, maybe a teacher that you've had. Again, you can think of teachers as managers too, in terms of managers and leaders, where, we have, a set content that we have to get out. And some teachers are really, really good about, inspiring students and, getting them to follow. And, some teachers, quite frankly, aren't as good as that, and that's, it's not to bash, other teachers. It's just kind of how, it's just kind of how it is. Everybody's personality and their style is a little bit different. Some styles are really easy to kind of get people to follow you, get people to go behind you. And, sometimes it's, not so easy, right? So you have to kind of consider that, when it comes into as well, making decisions about, okay, who's going to be the manager, who's going to be the leader. You kind of have to make those decisions on, oh yeah, people have different strengths and weaknesses, and maybe this person is really good in their role, but maybe they're not necessarily an individual who can inspire, right? So you kind of have to, again, as a manager, as a head of a company, you kind of have to understand your people and what ultimately are going to be the biggest strengths of an individual. From there, we move to the 6 sources of power. So we have legitimate power. So this is influencing behavior because one person's formal position. So legitimate power, all managers have this. It results from the manager's formal position within the organization. So all managers have legitimate power over their employees, deriving from their position, whether it's a construction boss, account supervisor, sales manager, CEO. Okay, legitimate power, just kind of like it sounds. I am the manager. I am the boss. Okay, I have the legitimate power. Then we have reward power, influencing behaviors by promising or giving rewards. So rewards power, all managers have the power, is the power that results from managers' authority to reward their subordinates. Rewards can range from pay raises, from recognition to promotions. Then we have coercive power, which coercive power, a little less fun, influencing behaviors by threatening and giving punishment. So coercive power, again, all managers have the ability to do this, results from managers' authority to punish their subordinate. Punishment can range from verbal or written reprimands to demotions or to terminations. In some lines of work, fines and suspensions may be used. Okay, so coercive power is, I think it's kind of the poster child for, what we see in a bad manager, where we think that, a lot of times we have to do work because of fear or punishment. And I think that's where a lot of people, when their mind goes to the worst, think about the worst manager possible. I think a lot of people go to the idea of coercive power, right? Where it's the threat of punishment. And, you know, that really kind of being it in terms of, okay, this is how I'm going to get you to do this, or, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to get written up. Right. So you have to, so that's kind of it's kind of like the poster child for bad manager. And especially if you have to go to the coercive power, well, a lot, it doesn't really bode well necessarily for your tenure as a manager or as a person of influence. Then we have expert power, influencing behavior because of one's expertise. So expert power is power resulting from one's specialized information or expertise. Expertise or special knowledge can be mundane, such as knowing the work schedules and assignments of the people who report to you. Right. So expert power is just the individual who knows what they're doing. Right. So you think about, as teachers, and you may chuckle at this, you think about managers, in an ideal world, the teacher has what we call the expert power, where they come in and they're the authority on the content or the subject matter that they know. It doesn't mean that they know it all, right? But it also knows, they also, they know they know their stuff, right? They're going to be able to articulate and communicate that as well. And then that expert power too, of just the art of teaching, right? And understanding how to run a classroom, manage a classroom, how to transition, from activity to activity. That sort of expert power too also lends itself really well to a teacher, and a good teacher, has that sort of expert power on how to run a classroom. Then you've got referent power, so influencing behavior because of one's personal attraction. So referent power is power deriving from one's personal attraction. Referent power may be associated with managers, but it is more likely to be the characteristic of leaders. So with this one, again, it's kind of that idea of, people getting galvanized behind, an individual, as an individual who can inspire people. And I think that power is not one that all managers possess. It takes us, truly kind of a special leader to, have that sort of referent power to exercise in the office. Then we have informational power. So informational power influencing behavior because of logical and or valuable information one communicates. So information power is power deriving from one's access to information, although not included as a separate source of power in the original research on power bases in organizations. Later research added informational power to the typology. So with informational power, there are going to be in organizations people who find out things first within an organization. And then when you have that sort of information, you have then the power to act on that sort of information where, if I'm, maybe a lower level manager and I don't have that information, well, I can't necessarily act on it because, well, I don't have that power. I don't have the access to that sort of information. If I see, if the CEO of the company, begins to understand the earnings report of an organization and sees that it ain't going to be so good, and now they have to start making, cuts. That's an example of informational power where, I'm not going to have that ability to make those sorts of decisions because, well, I simply don't have that information, right? So informational power, because of the valuable information one communicates, is something that can be a little bit more specialized within an organization. All right. Then we use common influence tactics. So common influence tactics, so consensus efforts to affect and change behaviors in others. So rational persuasions, this is trying to convince someone with reason, logic, or facts. Inspirational appeals, trying to build enthusiasm by appealing to others' emotions, ideals, or values. Consultation, getting others to participate in planning, decision making, and changes. Ingratiation, getting someone in a good mood prior to making a request. Personal appeals, referring to friendship and loyalty when making the request or asking a friend to do a favor. Exchange, making explicit or implied promises and trading favors. Coalition tactics, getting others to support you in your efforts to persuade someone. Pressure, demanding compliance or using intimidation or threats. Legitimate tactics, basing a request on authority, organizational rules or policy or explicit implied support from supervisors. So these are some of the common influence tactics that individuals will use. And, depending on where you fall in terms of personality, some of these influence tactics may not, work all that, do may not work all that well, either you using them or you sort of receiving them. I like the ingratiation one of, trying to get somebody in a good mood prior to, making a request. I think that's like the age old, I'm going to try to get out of school today. Like I'm going to try to call in sick. So I'm going to I'm going to do some nice things for mom or dad to like get them to go along with this plan of me not having to go to school today. I think that's a good one. The personal appeals, with that one, if you have a manager that you're not necessarily maybe friends with, like you're good with them, but you're not necessarily, friends, that's a tough one, especially with the personal appeals. The exchange one, that's a dangerous road to go down in terms of, what are the promises or trades being made that can be a very big gray area in terms of what's being asked. Then you have coalition tactics. There are strengths in numbers. So if you can get, multiple people to sort of get on board with whatever you're proposing, that can really help. With pressure, demanding compliance, intimidation, or threats, that one, I think that becomes again sort of like the poster child of like bad influence. That one in exchange of bad influence, common tactics that individuals can use. And then you have the legitimate factor, which that one, if you're a manager, you understand that you reserve that right as the legitimate power. But again, I don't know how much you want to go to the well with legitimate tactics of, hey, just do this because I'm your boss. That shtick kind of seems to get old with today's generation. You really want to try and, whether it's rational persuasion, inspirational, maybe consultation, you kind of want to, bring in the employee on it, really get them believing that whatever you need them to do is also going to benefit them in the long run. And people now, and not to say they didn't in the past, but people now really need to feel that they are benefiting from it, that they're going to be a legitimate part of it. And sometimes the tactic of do this because I'm your boss isn't necessarily the most, it's maybe not going to get the most out of your employees if you just continue to go to that well. So those are some common influence tactics there that you can see. How to use the tactics to influence others. So rely on the core. So core influence, right? So we've kind of talked about that. Collab, consultation, rational persuasion, inspiration. Be authentic. consult rather than um, legitimate, excuse me. Some employees more apt to accept when they rely on consultative. Okay, we kind of just talked about that. Ingratiation, not a great long-term strategy. The whole let's get them in a good mood. Be subtle, and then you learn to influence. It's one of those things that influence tactics can be learned, and it can be a little bit of a struggle, especially early on, to try and figure out how to get people to do things. But as a manager, once you kind of start to get more experience and understand, what exactly makes your people the most effective in their situation, it becomes a little bit easier. All right. Now we kind of take a look here as we kind of start to move into 14.2. We're going to take a look at trait approaches. So, do leaders have distinctive traits and personal characteristics? So, positive task-oriented traits, about negative and interpersonal attributes. What do we know about gender and leadership? Are knowledge and skills important? So, what do we know about the leadership traits? So, that's what we're going to kind of take a look here in this in section 14.2 of your textbook. So, we see here positive task-oriented traits and positive negative interpersonal attributes. So positive task-oriented traits, so intelligence, conscientiousness, openness to experience, emotional stability, positive affect. Those are the positive task-oriented traits. Positive interpersonal attributes, extroversion, agreeableness, having a strong sense of emotional intelligence. So those are definitely the possible attributes of interpersonal, task, getting people to do things. And we have the negative interpersonal attributes, so narcissism, Machiavellianism, excuse me, and then psychopathy. You don't want to see those. Those are maybe not the not so good. So narcissism, that's a self-centered perspective, feelings of superiority, and a drive for personal power and glory. Machiavellianism, so inspired by pessimistic beliefs of Niccolo Machiavelli, a philosopher and writer in the Italian Renaissance. Machiavellianism displays a cynical view of human nature and condones opportunistic and unethical ways of manipulating people and putting results over principles. And then psychopathy is characterized by a lack of concern for others, impulsive behavior, and a dearth of remorse when a psychopath's actions harm others. So those are the negative interpersonal attributes. With the positive task traits, the positive interpersonal attributes. Hopefully, you're a little bit more familiar with those, and hopefully, you've seen a little bit more of that when it comes to dealing with people of power and influence. Although you have to recognize that the negative interpersonal attributes are certainly some that do exist in the world today, and unfortunately are used fairly often. So, what do we know about gender and leadership? So, are women represented in leadership positions? Do men and women vary in terms of leadership? And are there social factors working against women? So, are women represented? Women make up more than half of the workforce and more than half of all college students in the United States, but they're still fighting to achieve gender parity in leadership. Do men and women vary in terms of leadership? So, researchers have studied gender and leadership in terms of whether women and men are equally likely to emerge as leaders, whether they engage in different leader behaviors or use different styles of leadership, and whether they vary in terms of effectiveness as leaders. And then, are there social factors working against women leaders? So, women's representation in leadership is increasing, but nowhere do their numbers approach their proportion of the overall population. So, I think with this, and I think you're seeing the trends start to play out a little bit more here, especially as we've gotten into the late 2000s and now through the 2010s and early into the 2020s. You're seeing whether it's women in power, racial minorities in power. You're starting to see that uptick in terms of more representation. It's still to a point where it's probably not where it needs to be, but you're starting to see progress move in the correct direction, which as they say, Rome wasn't built in one day. Like I said, it's probably not where it needs to be yet, but you're starting to see that occurring more and more, where representation is starting to grow. So, and I don't foresee that changing anytime soon. So I think gender and leadership, it's a fact. It's one of those things that again, it's the statistics aren't the greatest right now. They're better than what they were, but I still think there's progress, but still frankly a long way to go in terms of sort of seeing that equal representation in terms of, in this case, women in leadership, on par with the male counterparts. Are knowledge and skills important? So cognitive abilities to identify problems and their causes in rapidly changing situations, interpersonal skills to influence and persuade others, business skills to maximize the use of organizational assets, and then conceptual skills to draft an organization's mission, vision, strategies, and implementation and plans. So in short, yeah, knowledge and skills are important. It's one of those things where expert power sort of becomes such an important factor in organizations where, if you're a person who, works under a manager and gets highly skilled at their position, you want to be working for an individual who knows and understands what they're doing. It's not one, and more importantly, and along with that, you also want to know a manager, as a manager, you recognize that you are skilled as an expert power, but also recognize that your employees can get very skilled themselves as well. And just because you're the one with the manager title doesn't necessarily always mean that you know best every single time. So you kind of have to understand those interpersonal skills to influence and persuade others. It's become, a more collaborative state of mind in terms of managing people nowadays. So I think, yeah, the short answer is, of course, knowledge and skills are important. You want to be able, as the manager, and perceived as a leader within an organization, yeah, you want to have all of the abilities to identify problems, and figure out in a rapidly changing situation how to achieve those changes. Table 14.4, take a look at table 14.4, and we see that on page 609. So we talk about what leaders need. So we got cognitive abilities, interpersonal skills, business skills, conceptual skills. So you guys can take a little bit of a more in-depth look there on page 609, and it actually wraps around on the back of page 610. Some really good information there on just the different abilities and skills needed by the managers to be able to manage employees, and really what it takes to be a good manager and a good leader in today's day and age. So what do we know about leaderships and traits? So we can't ignore the implications of leadership traits. So the positive and dark triad of traits suggest that qualities that are conducive and detrimental to successful organization and leadership roles. So organizations may want to include personality and trait assessments in their selection and evaluation process. Cross-cultural competency is an increasingly valued task-oriented trait. So, traits play a central role in the way we perceive leaders, and they do ultimately affect the leadership effectiveness. The dark triad, the positive. So, narcissistic leaders have often found great groundbreaking ideas, but fail to execute them successfully. Organizations may want to include personality and trait assessments in their selection and evaluation process. They are legitimate concerns about bias and accuracy associated with workplace personality testing. Organizations should stick with validated job-related personality assessments and should use them for developmental purposes rather than employment decisions. And then 4, cross-cultural competency is an increasingly valued task-oriented trait. A global mindset is your belief in your ability to influence dissimilar others in a global context.